This is M-Wire, Movie Week in Review. M-Wire is brought to you by Audible.com. Sign up today to get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/geekcastradio. Start today with a free 30-day trial with over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Don't forget to follow Audible on Twitter at audible_com. And now the latest and greatest in movies with M-Wire.
Can we risk not launching?
The world is on the brink.
Prepare to counterattack.
And only one man can save us now.
What a scoop!
Effective immediately, I'm going to rid our planet of all nuclear weapons.
But the greatest threat to Superman is Lex Luthor.
You'd risk worldwide nuclear war for your own personal financial gain.
Do you know what I can do with a single strand of Superman's hair?
You can make a toupee that flies.
Let's just keep your IQ a family secret, okay?
Okay.
He's created a being more powerful than the Man of Steel.
Well, smarter than I thought. You'll pierce his skin. Dance on his grave.
What are you doing back in Metropolis?
Dude of Steel. Where are you gonna get it?
Is that adorable?
Christopher Reeve, Gene Hackman, Jackie Cooper, John Cryer, with Mariel Hemingway and Margot Kidder
Clark, things aren't that bad. Clark, stop!
as Lois Lane. Superman 4, his greatest adventure, the quest for peace.
Hello and welcome to the DC Spotlight Volume 2, M-Wire's Spotlight on the Superman films, which is brought to you by the Geekcast Radio Network and Audible.com. I am one of your hosts, Steve, Joe, and Mike, and joining me is Nuclear Dan. Oh, I'm sorry, Movie Revolt Dan.
Hello, yes, and I did not cut my nails for 3 weeks, especially for this podcast, so...
Yeah. It's... If you couldn't tell from last week and the week before, we are doing Superman 4 this time around. We're attempting a quest for peace. Oh boy. This is going to be an interesting record, ladies and gentlemen, because of the simple fact that Dan had never seen this movie up until this viewing.
Yeah. That was a fact that I was really proud of, and yeah. Not so much anymore.
Now you hang your head in shame.
Now I am a victim of Superman 4 like many others. So.
See, I don't think it's just nostalgia for me. I said in the Superman 3 record that, and I think I said it in the Supergirl one as well, Superman 4 was kind of like the point for me as a kid, as a 7, 8, and and again, as I said in those records, I didn't see it till I was 10, so I saw it 3 years after it came out. As a 10-year-old in the late 80s, early 90s, for me, that was my... It's kind of... I hate to compare it to this, but the Superman franchise is kind of like the Indiana Jones franchise. Whatever year those films came out, and you were old enough to kind of comprehend it, but you weren't young enough where you didn't get it. Like, Superman 4, to me, that was the version that I got, the version that I understand. Just like with Indiana Jones, for me, my favorite film out of that franchise is Last Crusade. So it's one of those things where, yes, I understand Superman 4 is bad. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's a good movie. I'm just saying that at the time, in 1990, that was my Superman movie at that age.
Yeah, and it basically is what exposed you to the franchise. And I could
It didn't
understand
just
that.
it didn't just expose me to the franchise. I had seen the others previously. I had, but it was like, okay, Superman 1, man, I probably saw that when I was 6 or 7. Same thing with 2, and I got it. I understood it, but it wasn't like, I wasn't like someone who might have been born in 78 or 73 or whatever. Like Michael Wilson, who is a longtime contributor slash third or fourth on the GCRN totem pole as far as staff goes. He was born in 73, so by 78 he was 5 years old. 5 or 6, and by that time, whenever VHS or Betamax or whatever for Superman the movie came out, I'm sure that was his Superman, because he was old enough to really get it, really understand it, and really like it. And as a kid, I enjoyed Superman 3. I still enjoy Supergirl to this day. I mean, hell, JT and I spent an hour and 10 minutes or so on Supergirl. Is probably going to be, unless Optibotimus next week with Shitty Returns, unless he, argues with us for an hour and a half, Supergirl is probably going to be the longest episode in this spotlight for us on the Superman films.
Wow, you guys talked about an hour for Supergirl. That's impressive.
Well, JT, he likes to talk. He's Canadian. We get it. But the thing is that not only was he doing the Just the Facts and plot summarized it, we actually went through almost the entire plot of the movie after his Just the Facts played. So, yeah, sorry about that, listeners. But no, this here, Superman 4, it just holds a special place in my heart. Yes, I know it's a bad movie, but people can like bad. I guess this would be one of my guilty pleasures, because I know it's bad. I don't give a shit. I still like it.
Yeah, I could understand. I could understand why a 10-year-old would like this movie, because it feels like it was written by a 10-year-old. So I can see the correlation there. But we all have those movies that we loved as kids that maybe as we look back on, we're not the most proud of. Like, I love the Mighty Ducks movie. Now watching it as an adult, I could say, well, it's not the greatest thing in the world. But, yeah, not being exposed to this film as a kid and watching it as an adult, it is not the most pleasant experience in the world. Though I will say, I probably laughed more at Superman 4 than I did at Superman 3, except that, the laughs weren't intentionally made by the film, because there's just some things in Superman 4 which are just downright hilarious in the most wrong way possible. It is kind of a guilty pleasure in the sense that you can take a lot of pleasure out of some of the most ridiculous plot lines and just what it takes place in that movie. It's absolutely crazy.
Yes. So let's head it over to JT with the Just the Facts for Superman 4. We'll be back with our thoughts and other stuff after this.
Superman 4 begins with some space junk striking the Russian space station, causing it to spin out of control, and sending a Russian cosmonaut who is working on the exterior of the station out into space. Superman quickly arrives and rights the station and rescues the cosmonaut before waving goodbye and heading for the old Kent farm in Smallville. It seems the old homestead is being put up for sale, and while reminiscing, Clark is drawn into the barn by a signal from the ship that brought him to Earth. Discovering another green crystal, Clark views a message from his birth mother, Lara, who tells him the crystal contains the last remaining bit of Kryptonian energy in the universe and that he should use it wisely. Before he can fully comprehend what he has discovered, Clark hears the arrival of Mr. Hornsby, the realtor handling the land sale. Hornsby tells Clark about a company that wants to buy the land sight unseen, but Clark dismisses the sale, not wanting to sell unless it's to someone who's interested in the farm itself. Clark then hustles back to Metropolis and just barely misses the subway and a waiting Lois Lane. However, the engineer has a heart attack and the train rolls out of control. Hearing the cries of the trapped commuters, Clark changes into Superman and flies down the tunnel to intercept the train. Superman flies ahead of the train and steps on the third rail, cutting off the train's power. After making sure the engineer gets some medical attention, Superman checks on the passengers and reminds them that the subway, and not flying apparently, is the safest way to travel. Superman then flies to the Daily Planet and discovers that media mogul David Warfield has bought the planet with intentions to turn it into a muckraking tabloid. Having none of this, Perry White leaves and tries to find a way to buy the paper back. Clark makes an impassioned plea about truth in journalism which garners the attentions of the new editor, Lacey, Mr. Warfield's daughter. And what about that bald, brilliant baddie Lex Luthor? Well, he's still in prison and on a work detail in a quarry. However, he is soon rescued from this drudgery by his nephew Lenny Luthor, who distracts the guards with his fancy tricked-out car before escaping with his beloved uncle. Naturally, Luthor's first plan after escaping is to destroy Superman. And to this end, he and Lenny steal a sample of Superman's hair from an exhibit at a local museum, which the arrogant Elder Luthor plans to use to create a creature that will destroy Superman.
You know what I can do with a single strand of Superman's hair?
You can make a toupee that flies.
That hair is a sample of Superman's genetic material, the building blocks of his body. With my genius and enough nuclear power to mutate the genes, I can create a being who's more powerful than him. His total allegiance to me.
As Luthor schemes, the world slides towards global nuclear war as peace talks between the world's superpowers have broken down. After seeing the president on television talking about how America will lead the nuclear arms race, a young schoolboy named Jeremy is inspired to write to Superman, begging him to do something about the nukes. Clark is moved by the boy's pleas, but is stymied about what he can do. He heads to the Fortress of Solitude and consults the holograms of the Kryptonian elders. I guess Hollow Jor-El was busy that day, and they suggest Superman pick up sticks and move to a planet where war doesn't exist anymore. Superman says nuts to that and decides to fight for his adopted home by speaking to the UN Council. He announces he will solve the problem of nuclear war by ridding the world of nuclear arms. This idea is met with overwhelming applause because who's going to say no to Superman? And all the nukes in the world are gathered and launched into space, where Superman gathers them into a big net and tosses the whole kit and caboodle into the sun. However, Luthor, enacting the next phase of his plan, sneaks onto an army base where the last remaining nuke is and attaches a small box containing some protoplasm he has created using Superman's DNA. It turns out that Luthor also plans on profiting from Superman's actions by rearming the world's governments in the aftermath. When the nukes are destroyed by the sun, the resulting release of energy causes the protoplasm to develop into a creature called Nuclear Man. Overflowing with power, the radioactive mutant returns to Luthor's penthouse, where the evil genius congratulates himself on his accomplishment. He also discovers Nuclear Man has one fatal flaw. He is entirely dependent on solar energy for power. A nuclear-themed supervillain, and he's solar-powered. Right. Anyway, while on a double date with Lois and Lacey, where he has to constantly duck out and change back and forth from one identity to the other, Clark detects a hypersonic signal from Luthor that leads him to his penthouse. The last son of Krypton arrives and confronts Luthor, but Nuclear Man fights him and draws him away. Nuclear Man leads Superman around the world as they fight, and the nuclear-powered Neanderthal sets off a volcano and destroys the Great Wall of China in hopes to distract Superman. Our hero is barely slowed down by these events, and finally Nuclear Man takes the Statue of Liberty and tries to drop it on the citizens of Metropolis. Superman catches it in time, but leaves himself vulnerable to Nuclear Man, who scratches him with his radioactive nails. Severely injured, Superman manages to replace the Statue of Liberty, but is kicked into the sky by Nuclear Man, with only his cape left flapping in the breeze. Presumed dead by everyone except Lois, it looks like the radioactive scratch from Nuclear Man has poisoned Clark, who falls ill and starts to rapidly age. With Superman out of action, Lex begins raking in the money from his arms deals, while Nuclear Man becomes enamored with Lacey Warfield after seeing her picture on the front page of the Daily Planet. Nuclear Man starts wreaking havoc on the streets of Metropolis as he searches for Lacey. Meanwhile, as the rampage continues, Clark digs out the green crystal that he pocketed earlier and uses the energy to reconstitute himself so he can confront Nuclear Man one more time. Returning to the battle just as Nuclear Man closes in on Lacey, the two Titans resume their struggle. Superman lures Nuclear Man into an elevator, cutting him off from the sun, which causes him to shut down. The Man of Steel flies the elevator into space and dumps it on the moon's surface, but a crack in the door allows Nuclear Man to recharge, and he begins the fight again. During the battle, Superman is buried in the ground while Nuclear Man finds Lacey at the Daily Planet and flies her out towards space. Superman climbs out of the ground and manages to rescue Lacey by causing an eclipse, allowing him to then deal with Nuclear Man by dropping him into an atomic reactor where the nuclear nuisance is destroyed. The film comes to an end with Perry White buying back controlling interest in the newspaper and ousting the Warfields. while Superman captures the two generations of Luthors. He takes Lenny Luthor back to a reform school, and the elder Lex is sent back to prison before Superman flies off, continuing his never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way.
You've already broken all the laws of man, Luthor. Now, it looks as though you've broken the laws of nature, too. I can only assume you must have hidden a device of some kind in one of those missiles I hurled into the sun.
You know, Mr. Muscle, I'm gonna really miss these little chats we had together. You're the only one that could keep up with me.
Superman 4: The Quest for Peace was directed by Sidney Furie, who also wrote and directed 3 out of the 4 movies in the Iron Eagle film series. The film was also produced by Mark Rosenthal, who some film aficionados may know for his screenwriting work on such films as Mercury Rising and Mighty Joe Young. The cast of the film was led by Christopher Reeve in what would be his final performance as Superman. The cast also included a returning Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor, John Cryer as Lenny Luthor, Mariel Hemingway and Sam Wanamaker as Lacey and David Warfield, and Mark Pillow as the atomic antagonist Nuclear Man. Superman 4 is almost universally hated by fans and critics alike, so much so that it's hardly worth mentioning what people thought of the film. The film is so displeasing to fans that it carries a rotten rating of 10% on RottenTomatoes.com. Critics by and large agreed the film had none of the flair, humor, or action of any of the previous films in the Superman series, and many reviewers suggest that only the most hardcore of hardcore Superman fans might enjoy this film. And that's not the only interesting thing about the film. Producers actually thought they had a shot of recapturing the glory days of the franchise with this movie's script, and had asked Richard Donner if he would return to direct. He declined, as did Richard Lester, who was also asked. Even Freddy Krueger's creator, Wes Craven, was approached, but left the project after clashing with star Christopher Reeve. And speaking of Richard Donner, after famously standing by Donner after his firing, Gene Hackman was convinced to return to the role of Lex Luthor one final time. The film also received numerous cuts during production, losing about a half an hour of film. The deleted scenes were later considered to be used as a basis for a 5th film in the series, but this idea was quickly scrapped after the film's poor performance at the box office. And perhaps most amusingly, Superman 4 is the first, last, and only time actor Mark Pillow, Nuclear Man himself, has ever appeared on screen. I'm just going to come out and say it, this movie sucks. I mean, Christopher Reeve really only did this film because Warner Brothers agreed to co-finance a personal film project of his if he played Superman one more time, and in my opinion, Superman 4 is one of the worst comic book movies of all time. Almost as bad as Howard the Duck. I was more convinced of the danger of Richard Pryor's supercomputer in Part 3 than I was of Nuclear Man and his press-on nails. Seriously, avoid making eye contact with this movie. I'm JT from Saskatoon, and this was just the facts for Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. Now, I'm sending it back to the rest of the crew on today's M-Wire. Later.
What is that god-awful noise you're making?
Mozart, my low forehead friend. Even this wretched pit can't diminish the spirit of true genius.
Thank you so much, JT, for those just facts. I believe it was, I don't think I mentioned it with JT. I might have at the very end of the Supergirl episode, but I know I mentioned it with you in the Superman 3 episode of the DC Spotlight Volume 2 here on M-Wire. It was that because I saw this film in 1990, 1991, and I read the novelization to go along with it, the entire time, every time I would either have the movie, I would almost have the movie on in the background and be listening to Madonna's The Immaculate Collection album. I don't know why. I do know every time I read the novelization, I would have that playing, and I have no idea why. So yeah, Madonna and Superman, that's a combination that no one ever thought of. The plot of the film basically is Lex Luthor, like JT said, Lex Luthor, his half-witted nephew breaks him out and steals a strand of Superman's hair and creates Nuclear Man, and it's this whole threat and this whole thing of, Superman's going to save the world by outlawing nuclear weapons. The plot is very heavy-handed, and I think it was a plot that at the time of the film's release in '87 was very relevant to that time, because weren't we like in the midst of the whole nuclear, like
you saw the Cold War going on. I mean, it's actually one of the Berlin Wall fall. I mean, fortunately my history is not working the best for me, but it's near the end of the Cold War when this was made. So, if anything, like the nuclear race is still obviously prevalent. It still is to this day. I think it's always going to be. So that aspect of it was still there, and with the '80s, and that was always a huge threat. The Cold War kind of got a little bit warmer during that decade, and you look at a lot of the action films of that period. Who are the protagonists? More often than not, it's Russians. Red Dawn, Rocky. A lot of different action films, it's always the Russians, and I think this necessarily isn't Russians or the bad guy, but the nuclear threat is the key aspect of what he's doing, and most of that comes from the Cold War, because you have America on one side, Russia on the next. They have tons of nuclear weapons. Today's a little bit different. Today is more so the terrorist aspect of it, but still within this time period, yes, it's a very relevant plot device within the 80s of trying to rid the world of nuclear weapons. And I could see why they did it. I could see there is a potential for a quality story there. It just doesn't really make sense the way he does it, and the way they're just kind of all okay with it. I think, if anything, you can kind of... It also doesn't seem like something a Superman would do. If you look at Superman 1, Superman 2, he was really hesitant to be that hero, or he wasn't going to be the complete savior. He was just going to kind of go when he was needed, and I think this was kind of going against a lot of what was established in those films. That struggle he had, and it seems like he's just kind of, I'm just gonna take control and be the all-powerful being of Earth and just kind of do what I want. Yes, his heart's in the right place, but it does seem kind of to go against the core of the Superman character.
Yeah, it's a little wonky, folks. It really, really is. I don't know. I don't like the whole subplot of the planet having to be taken over and having, I believe, and again, I'm not looking it up, I believe Ernest Hemingway's ancestor be this sex pot. I just don't, because honestly, that's what this whole film almost is. It's almost a very, very PG version of a porno half the time when it comes to the Lacey Warfield character.
Yeah, I felt more so it's like putting Superman in a bad sitcom. It's so many, like the double date sequence where he's trying to be Clark Kent and Superman at the same time. I don't know why he would even do that, like what the purpose of like even agreeing to something like that is. Like that went on for way too long, and it was just so kind of ridiculously stupid. And you said subplots, and there are a billion subplots in this movie, because you have the quest for peace, you have Lex Luthor's story, you have the Daily Planet, and it's okay to have a lot of subplots, but this are just kind of, just so happenstance and so non-sequential, and makes no sense half the time.
Yeah. Well, the only storyline out of this entire film that makes sense is technically the quest for peace and Lex Luthor storylines. They're not one and the same, but they're obviously tied together. More so than the Daily Planet and the Warfields and all that double date bull crap. If this was just a film, Lex Luthor versus Superman, it would have been a hell of a lot better. You could have a subplot with the Daily Planet, but I hate to say it, but apparently Spider-Man 3 took a cue from this movie. Spider-Man 3 has too many villains, most people say. This film has Superman 4 has way too many plots.
Yeah, and they're all kind of really half-assed, honestly.
They are.
The whole creation of Nuclear Man is so ridiculous. It's like, okay, we're gonna get a hair for Superman. How we get that hair, where that hair comes from, that's who cares? We're gonna just create this Deus Ex Machina device so we can create Nuclear Man, who was born wearing a cape. So it's like whatever concoction he came up with, he made sure that concoction created a being that had a cape on, which I always thought was hilarious. Just that graphic of seeing him going from the fetus to the Nuclear Man was pretty hilarious.
Yeah, it was.
But
it really was.
The thing that really caught me with this was the fact that Gene Hackman came back for this movie. I'm really surprised that he would even dare to return to this franchise after the third film. Because it's not like he was down on his luck with his career. I mean, he just did Hoosiers the year before. The next year after, he's doing Mississippi Burning. I don't know why. Maybe he just wanted to return to that role. I do think he's fine. I think he's probably the only person that's really giving a performance in this that's worthy of anything. But I was really surprised he came back to this franchise.
Well, he gives two great performances because he is the voice of Nuclear Man.
True. I try to forget about that, but that is very true.
Well, see, that's the thing. It's like JT mentioned, the actor that actually plays Nuclear Man but isn't his voice. Mark Pillow has never acted past this. Like, this was the debut of Mark Pillow and the death knell of Mark Pillow. It's like, boom, nail in coffin right there. Superman 4. You'll never get another acting role in this town again.
I felt like he was just someone who didn't make it as a pro wrestler, so they threw him into this movie.
Imagine if they had used a different pro wrestler. I don't know if he was wrestling yet, but he's another Mark, and I hate to ruin people's image of the WWE and a certain Undertaker. Oh, but yeah, no, I don't know. See, to me, Nuclear Man, it's Lex Luthor. Now, I know for a fact that in other comics and other versions of Superman, and other animated films and live action stuff, there's always this whole thing of Superman clones, whether it's robots, whether it's Lex getting DNA. That's how Bizarro was kind of created, as a dumber clone of Superman. The whole cloning thing with Superman, or whatever you want to call it, it's kind of like what Pryor did with what Gus Gorman did with the Kryptonite. You never have all the right ingredients to make the perfect Superman. Yes, Nuclear Man is more powerful. He has nails of nucleon, I guess. I don't know. Whatever. But he obviously has a weakness that he has to consistently run on solar energy. Makes no damn sense. But I think Nuclear Man was their way of working around the whole doomsday thing. I don't think in the 80s you could have had a legitimate person be Doomsday. They didn't have motion capture back then. They didn't have... I mean, they had like suits that people could build and make, but honestly, do you want to see a Doomsday suit with the actor's face in the helmet? Oh, hi, Norman Osborn from Spider-Man 1 in 2002. Anyway, but it's one of those things where I think Nuclear Man was their attempt at Doomsday / a Superman clone.
Yeah, and I think like Nuclear Man in his most basic formation could work, and I think the idea of doing something like a nuclear-powered Superman makes sense. It can go with this plot. It's just the execution of it is off. Like, that's the whole thing with this movie. It's execution-wise, and I mean, I think a big part of it is the fact that these are new producers. The budget on this was cut in half right before production, so they're really working with absolutely nothing, and you can tell with what's on screen. I mean, they cut 30 minutes of the movie beforehand. That's never a good sign. So I agree. I think there is potential, and I think it is better than doing something like Doomsday or Darkseid or something crazy like that, because you just don't have the technology back then to pull that off. It's just what they did with them. It was just really pointless. Just seeing them going, like, you see Nuclear Man turning on a volcano, picking up the Statue of Liberty, just these random events, and I could see what they're trying to go for. It's like, hey, we finally have these. Let's show Superman, going all out against this hero, and I do think there is like a sense almost. It is very ambitious. I'll give Superman that for that. It's a very ambitious film for what that ambition, unfortunately, does not really come to fruition all that well. But I do appreciate that. Like the fight on Mars, or not Mars, but the moon. Like that was actually, I'm like, wow, that's actually not too bad. I mean, there's a lot of potential there. But I do agree with you regarding what they're trying to do with that character.
Yeah, it was cool at the time as a kid. Watching it again now, I was like, this is so heavy-handed and derivative. It just, and I always say it's interesting when creators make, like, when we go back and look at stuff from this time, or when you have a show. And again, I'm going to bring up a TV show and a film podcast, but have you been paying attention to The Americans at all on FX? Do you watch that?
I have not, honestly.
The Americans, briefly, is basically what if the Russians, or it's the story of what happens if the Russians possibly win the Cold War, basically. And it's about Russian sleeper cells and this, that, and the other thing. And I think this year in 2013, having it started last year and went to this year for its first season. I think starting, 2012, 2013, it's really interesting that how much time has passed since the 80s, because it takes place like 1981, 82. So the early 80s. I love watching a show like that. And I sometimes love looking back on films like this and seeing what was going on at that time. As the film came out, like we said, it was 1987. Cold War was just ending or had ended. It might have still been going on a little bit, but it wasn't in its full-on scale. And I think that's cool, but the funny thing is, I didn't feel as out of this movie as I did with like Superman 3. Like we mentioned back in the Superman 3 episode, that beginning is so horrid in that movie. It just is. And here, I didn't feel that way. I didn't feel like I was like, oh my god, it's only been 8 minutes. It feels like it's been... I didn't have that feeling. I didn't have that feeling of time, that it was just slowed down so much.
No, I think editing-wise, they never really stood on one thing for all that long. Like, that opening sequence with Superman 3 went on for like 8, maybe 12 minutes or so. Here, I think the longest scene, the only real time I was like, this scene is going on for way too long, was the double date scene. The beginning,
it was just awkward.
It was awkward and pointless, and the comedy wasn't really all that funny. It was, it was kind of, you said derivative, and like that is very derivative because it's something you've seen before, done in a lot of different ways, and the only thing that's different is it's Superman this time, not someone else, and it just doesn't work. And again, it goes against the character of Superman because I don't think Superman would place himself in that situation. But even besides that, it's just horribly executed. But editing-wise, I think we talked about all the subplots, and with that, they never really stood at one point for too long. I mean, the fight between Nuclear Man and Superman just kind of go a little bit crazy, but then what I found interesting, I thought it was a kind of nearing its end, and then I was kind of surprised that you see Superman actually get kind of sick and ill and look really weakling. I wasn't expecting that to happen, but overall, yeah, I never had a dragging sensation, oh, this is going on for too long in a particular moment. As an overall movie, I did, but no scene really stuck out as overextended beyond its, welcome desire of what I wanted it to be.
I know every kid wanted to be the kid that always was, and I'm not counting, even though I'm going to use the phrase that coins Jimmy Olsen, but I'm not counting Jimmy. Every kid wanted to be Superman's pal. I'm sorry, Jeremy, I wanted to strangle that fucking kid. Oh my god. That was just so bad. The kid that was like, oh, Superman can do it. You gotta stop you gotta stop, you gotta stop these villains. You gotta stop this. You gotta stop this war. Stop these missiles. Oh my god, that kid was so annoying.
Yeah, That's the worst type of pandering. And I said this movie felt like it was written by a 10-year-old, and that's a perfect example. And it does feel like it's like a 10-year-old is going to be the key to getting Superman to do something, or that was that was really bad. It was it was trying to go for a Spielberg movement where you can kind of be sentimental and do it well, but it was just horrifically bad. The kid wasn't very good, and Christopher Reeve in this wasn't very good. He was just walking through the role, and he didn't really sell it really well. So,
well, the only reason, as JT pointed out in Just the Facts, the only reason why he even came back to this was that Warner Brothers agreed to, I think, not produce, but maybe back a future independent project he had going on at the time. And honestly, don't get me wrong, Reeve is my film Superman. He always will be. But honestly, I wouldn't have been surprised if they recast him in this role, in this specific film. I mean, it's great to see him against Hackman again as Luthor. That was awesome. But as we've already stated, too many plots. It should have just been one basic full-on story. I don't know.
Or at least like they had scenes that didn't really do anything, or just felt like they were just there for take up time, like the flying scene with Lois Lane and Superman, like that. Like we've seen that before. That's already been done, and it was
that was already drawn out way too long in Superman the movie.
Yeah, and then there's also lapse in logic in this when you have Nuclear Man bringing someone into space that can't breathe oxygen. Like you're gonna kill her. You can't breathe in space, and there's so many lapses in like physics and scientific wise. Yes, it doesn't work at all. Yeah, I get it. It's Superman. You can kind of have certain conceits, but still, it just shows that you're just kind of going through the motions. And who thought John Cryer's most embarrassing role would not be 2.5 Men, but actually be Superman 4? So, yeah. Not that he's bad. I just don't think I think it's more embarrassing to be in this movie than give that performance he did. But
the funny thing is, when I first heard about 2.5 Men before Charlie Sheen went crazy, I was like, ooh, John Cryer, where have I heard that name before? I had watched a couple of the early, like the first season episodes of 2.5 Men, and I didn't outright hate it, but I didn't, for me, it kind of like, it's there, whatever, I don't care, and I thought, where have I heard John Cryer's name before? It wasn't until rewatching this and until I heard JT's Just the Facts, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I don't know, and two, I don't know what decade he was living in, but it certainly was. It was like a cross between the 1980s and like 50s punk. It was interesting. His look he was going for. His car was pretty sweet. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, but
oh yeah, that car was awesome.
But yeah, I was very surprised to see him in this because it's one of those I know that guy. I can't think of where he is, and thank God for things like IMDb because you can just look it up really quickly. But I was very shocked to see John Cryer in Superman 4.
Yeah, he also, the biggest role that people would have remembered him from the 80s besides Superman 4 was Pretty in Pink. He was Ducky from Pretty in Pink. Other things people might know him for in film, he was in Hot Shots. John Washout. He was Washout in Hot Shots. Let's see. Honestly, I don't recognize Holy Man. Okay, I recognize Holy Man, but as far as his other film credits, not really a lot of films that he's done that I watched for television. I can't believe he was in an episode of Hannah Montana. He was on Family Guy. He was in 2 episodes of Hannah Montana. Holy crap. He was on Danny Phantom, American Dad, as we've already said, 2.5 Men. He was in Stripperella as a voice. That's interesting. So, I mean, he was in Dharma and Greg for an episode. So, I mean, he's had a successful television career. I think that's one of the things with certain actors. Certain actors gravitate towards a successful film career, and a dwindling television career, and certain actors do the opposite. They have a film career where looking at his listing on Wikipedia, 4, maybe 5 films out of all the stuff he's done since '84, whereas in the TV shows, I recognize more stuff that he's done. And but yeah, it was interesting seeing him as Lenny Luthor. And of course, Mariel Hemingway as Lacey. She was all right.
She was pretty horrible. I'm not gonna lie. She is not. Man, she just. Like watching her next to Margaret Kidder. You just saw just like, wow. I really appreciated that relationship between Christopher Reeve and her so much more after seeing those two together. I'm like, wow, they actually have chemistry. She just seems so force-fed into the story. Even Lana Lane from Superman 3 was so much better than she was. And one thing I wanted to mention too, I did like the relationship between Gene Hackman and John Cryer. They had some good give and take. I just like Gene Hackman's kind of completely derailing John Cryer or Lenny at every moment.
Oh yeah.
But and what's too, it's kind of what we should maybe talk about is how Christopher Reeve actually has a writing credit for this version of Superman that he it's I think the only one that he actually received credit for writing the script, which I'm surprised by, because you think someone of his caliber, he's been Superman for so long, would have a better sense of the character. So again, maybe it's more of a budget issue, maybe, or maybe he just doesn't have that ability as a screenwriter. Sometimes actors can kind of lose sight of certain things and think they are maybe more talented in certain areas than they really are. That could have led to such a kind of wonky plot that we had.
Yeah, as far as Marilyn Hemingway, as I mentioned earlier in the show, that she was a relative of Ernest Hemingway. She was his granddaughter, and apparently she was named after a Cuban fishing village that was a favorite of her father and grandfather. I'm sorry, being named after a Cuban fishing village, really?
Aren't we all?
Oh, that's funny. The rest of the cast is pretty much, Gene Hackman. We could go. I think we've already gone through his filmography and stuff. He's an amazing actor. He's done amazingly awesome roles since Lex Luthor. Christopher Reeve, may he rest in peace. He will always be Superman to a lot of us. So there's that. The rest of the cast, there's really, nothing. Like, there's nobody here. Okay, Robert Beatty is the U.S. president. Okay. That's great. But I mean, there's really nothing here. And Margot Kidder, we already talked about her back in Superman 1. Overall, I like the cast. Again, as we've kind of already said, it's not a good film, but they did their best with what they had to work with as far as the writing goes.
Yeah, I mean, I point to them for keeping their main core cast for so many movies, even if like certain people only in certain movies for a little bit, but they didn't really do any recasting for the most part. Think of something like Marvel, and they can't even keep one Hulk for more than one movie, or one War Machine for more than one movie. And for this, they had a pretty good continuity. So Jackie Cooper. I still love him as Perry White. I think he's really an unsung hero of this franchise. I don't think we would mention him enough, but he's perfect in that role. And I do like the fact that he kind of gets his moment in this to kind of buy back the Daily Planet. And overall, his performance within this franchise, he really fits that role perfectly. It's got really great comedic timing, and it's almost seeing like an early J. Jonah Jameson from the Spider-Man films. Their personalities. He's not as cartoonish as JJ, but he's just as fun.
Yeah, no, Perry. That's a battle I would like to see. Perry White versus J. Jonah Jameson. That would be awesome. I don't think next week when we talk about Superman Returns, there was no Perry. There was Richard White, the nephew of the Daily Planet editor-in-chief Perry White, and fiancé to Lois Lane. I don't. We'll get into that next week. But yeah, apparently Superman Returns, there was no Perry White, which that's kind of lame. Is there anything else you want to bring up? Because this movie, even though it's a guilty pleasure of mine, I'm pretty much done talking about it.
There's really Superman 4. It is a conundrum of a movie. It's one of those. I would say I put it in the same length as like the Roger Corman Fantastic Four movie from the 90s that was never released, where it's a good movie to watch with friends because it's hilariously bad. I'm not a big fan of like this they're so bad they're good movies because I think I don't seek those out because I'd rather watch a really good movie. But if you're looking for one that fits that mold, it's definitely Superman 4 because it's so ridiculous, it's so out there, and it's just takes itself so seriously at times, even though it's being so farcical. So I'm sure there's some great drinking games you can come up with. For every bad special effect, you take a shot. You might kill yourself if you do that. But
for every bad special effect, for every time Lacey basically, jumps Superman's bones, every time that Lex basically scolds Lenny, there's so many drinking games you could do with this film. We'd all have to go to the hospital for alcohol poisoning.
But yeah, Superman 3 I don't think was a great movie by any means, but after watching Superman 4, I've gained a new respect for Superman 3 because it's not nearly as bad as a train wreck as Superman 4. So
yeah. So we're going to take a quick break. You're going to hear some quick ads, and we'll come back with our final thoughts and final rating after this.
Coming to Grand Rapids, Michigan on September 21st and 22nd is GrandCon Gaming and Comics Convention, presented by Celebration Cinemas. Join us in playing or chatting it up with fellow enthusiasts in a community that understands your passions. Get lost in the adventure of your favorite role-playing game. Admire costumes and art from vendors and attendees. Meet the creators behind your favorite mainstream and independent games and comic books. Check out unpublished games and sneak peek at things to come. You can get all this and more at GrandCon. For more information, please visit www.grand-con.com.
All right, we are back here on M-Wire, and it is time for some final thoughts on Superman 4. As I said in the show earlier, this for me is a guilty pleasure. I can watch this movie and I can like it on its own, by itself. If I hadn't seen any of the previous films, I really can enjoy it. Looking at it with a critical eye and just seeing all the issues with the too many plots, with the horrible... they make Superman to be... they make Superman or / Clark Kent out to be a player in a management position. Pimp! Pretty much. At that double date scene. And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't at all. I see its faults, and I see, I don't know. What are your final thoughts?
Bottom line, Superman 4 is one of the worst comic book movies ever made. It should only be seen sparingly. There's no reason to seek this film out. It's unnecessary. It kind of makes it. It's the worst case of diminishing returns ever. If you look at where we went with Superman 1 and Superman 2 to where we're at now, it's an unnecessary movie that has unnecessary plot, and it's really painful. And the fact that we're continuing the same timeline within the next film makes me question exactly what they were thinking with Superman Returns. But I put it on the lowest of the low with comic book movies. Honestly, it's a failure on nearly every level. Yes, there's some, like, Gene Hackman makes it watchable, or there's some phony moments here and there. There's some minute things, and I do appreciate that there is some ambition to it. But overall, not a fan. Not gonna lie.
All right, so we are going to rate this on a 0 to 5 star scale. We also have half points in there as well. The way our star scale works is we have unrateable, painful, hated it, terrible, disliked it, barely failing, barely passing, liked it, really liked it, almost perfect, and perfect. I do still enjoy this film. I have to give it a barely passing. It is a bad movie. I'm not saying it isn't, but I can't with what our titles for our ratings are. I can't give it anything lower than a 3-star, barely passing. For me personally, I still enjoy this movie from time to time.
Wow. Well, there you go. I mean, if it's a guilty pleasure, it's a guilty pleasure. And I would, for those who want more like detailed information regarding the ratings, I advise on the website there's more writing up regarding this big write-up that Mike did on the ratings to kind of give a more official take, just as we're kind of rehashing things on the website. But I'm going to have to go with a big ol' half star for this one. I gave Superman 3 1.5 stars, and this one's I'm going to give it a big half star. And really that half star is primarily for Gene Hackman. And besides that, really not much else to take out of this movie. So.
Alrighty then. Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. We are through the Reeve generation of films, which is kind of sad with what we got in 2006 because, as I've said many times in the last, 6-7 years, Bryan Singer needed to take his mouth off of Dick Donner's dick for the next film that we'll be talking about next week, which is Superman I can't even say it. Superman Returns. So we'll catch you next week. For now, I am TFG and Mike with
Movie Revolt Dan.
Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep your eyes to the skies, ladies and gentlemen.
Just listen to Movie Week in Review on GeekCastRadio.com. If you would like to leave feedback on the show, there are many ways to do so. First, you can visit the website, GeekCastRadio.com, where you can comment on the episode and all of our different podcasts. Be sure to rate our show on iTunes and leave us feedback. You can follow us on Twitter at GCRNMwire. Become a fan of us on Facebook by searching Geekcast Radio Network. You can email us at feedback@geekcastradio.com. Call the voicemail line 502-526-5821. Please remember to tell us the show you're leaving the message for and your name. So until next time, unleash the geek in you.
In a world, there, I said it, happy